Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. Before I take you through the agenda, I just want to start by saying a big thank you to our panelists for being here, to the Patient, Family, and Learning Space for hosting us, and especially Erin Lowe from the Kundal Center who managed the organization for this event. So in the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to introduce you to the Depression and Autism Youth to Youth Guide. First, we'll give you some background on the timeline and evolution of this work. We're going to take time to describe and discuss the co-development process that we use to develop this tool. We're going to provide an overview of the different sections of the tip sheet, and then we're going to engage in Q&A and discussion across our panel. So we're hoping to get into the Q&A section by about 10 to 1, but we have until 1:30 booked for those folks who can stick around so that we have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. And just so folks know, the Q&A portion of this launch will not be recorded. Change slide, please. So what you see here is the cover page for the tip sheet package we're presenting today. This cover was designed by a very talented autistic young person on our team. The goal of the guide that we're presenting is to provide both information about autism and mental health broadly to autistic youth. So autistic youth we define as individuals who are about 14 to 25 years. And more specifically, this guide focuses on symptoms of depression that are commonly experienced among autistic youth. On the right of this cover page, you can see the components of the package, which we'll go through today. So information on why we created the package, what autism and depression can look like, information about getting help, coping strategies that youth on our team have found helpful, a note to caregivers, and a note to mental health professionals. The audience for this resource includes autistic youth, caregivers, and clinicians providing care to young people. The project initially began based on an interest to improve the quality of the resources we have available for the young people we serve in our autism and mental health clinics across the Child, Youth, and Family Service and Adult Neurodevelopmental Service here at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. Many individuals, autistic individuals, experience mental health challenges and need access to high-quality evidence-based care. This package is our first step to this goal, but we're very much aware that much more work needs to be done to improve mental health services for autistic youth. Some caveats. This package is not meant as a resource to make clinical diagnoses or treatment decisions, and the package is geared toward youth who can articulate for themselves. So some of the content is not well tailored to individuals with language impairment. We have adapted the sheets so that they're more accessible. That means that users can either read the documents or use a screen reader to access all of the content of the guide. Please take a look at our acknowledgement section. That's the second page of this cover that can be accessed when you look at the cover page of the tip sheet guide to see some of the names of the folks who contributed to this work. Some folks preferred to remain unlisted in the acknowledgement section. And I just want to take a moment to thank all of our team members, many of whom are online watching today. Next slide, and over to you, Alex and Riley.
Thank you. So just a note on language, for the purposes of the guide and today's presentation, we are using identity first language, i.e. autistic, as recommended by us, the youth advisors. We recognize that while there are a variety of opinions and feelings on the subject, we wanted to have identity first language as the default, as a sign of destigmatization and acceptance of autism as an inherent part of the individual. We invite individuals using this guide to use the language that they feel most comfortable with.
Okay, so here I'm going to take a couple of minutes to orient you to the timeline and the process that we undertook to complete this work. So our guide, as you can see here, is the culmination of more than 2 years of collected effort to develop the product. Our team of clinicians first put in a grant to the Family Services Community, a Family Services Community grant in the fall of 2019, proposing to create a mental health resource for autistic youth. We received funding in March 2020, exactly at the same time as the pandemic hit. So it took us a couple of months to organize ourselves after that. The grant funding that we received was supplemented by additional support from the Kundal Center for Child and Youth Depression and the Azrieli Adult Neurodevelopmental Center. That funding was critical to support compensation for engagement of folks with lived and living experience on the project and the production costs associated with the guide. With this support in hand, folks from the Azrieli Center, the Kundal Center, and Patient Family and Engagement at CAMH helped us to reach out to family and youth engagement networks within CAMH to advertise for this project and to recruit advocates to join our team. We finally got our multidisciplinary team together in about late fall, and we started meeting regularly, late fall of 2020. Once we had our team together, so our team included youth and caregiver advocates, as well as clinicians and other stakeholders who work across the GTA in hospitals and agencies that support young people with autism. Once we got our group together, we met regularly and we had to figure out what we would deliver. So we wanted to present a resource for autism and mental health, but we didn't know exactly what we would focus in on, and we wanted the co-development process to start there in terms of figuring out this focus. The first few months of our work together was dedicated to searching and evaluating mental health resources that were out there. And what we found is that the resources that were out there were dated. There were few for youth, few that were scholarly and evidence-based that focused on autism. And the available resources tended to be from one perspective, and there was little out there to support youth, but also parents and the clinicians providing care. I'm just going to remind folks to mute themselves because I think there's some background noise there. What floated to the top after we went through what resources were out there that there was a really big gap in tailored resources for youth, and particularly focused on mental health. We initially wanted to provide a broad resource, but then we quickly figured out that we needed to hone in our focus to make sure that what we delivered was going to be high quality and also feasible in the timeline that we had. As a core team, so we made a decision to focus on depression because of the huge needs. So it's very high prevalence of depression among youth with autism, and also because that focus aligned with the mandate and the expertise of our team. Once we landed on that goal, we realized we needed more perspectives included in order to develop content. We recruited more youth and caregivers from the various networks that I mentioned before, and we actually split off into 3 groups. So that's what you can see on the top of the slide on the left here. We had a core team that included our multidisciplinary team, and then we had 2 sub-teams, one of caregivers and one of youth, that developed the content with a facilitator that was part of our core team. Once the content was developed across the youth and caregiver groups, we went back and forth to kind of refine the content over time. There were some bumps along the way. These tended to be differences of opinion on focus, or sometimes a feeling among a member of the group that they weren't being heard or understood across the group. At these times, we debriefed and made a plan of how to improve communication. We were really fortunate throughout this co-development process that we were able to rely on CAMH's expertise in this domain. And there was some extra support in this regard in terms of debriefing and improving communication. And we were also really lucky that our team coalesced over time and we had the time for that process to take place. As you can see here, there was this kind of organic, this red hatch line process of how the co-development process took place over time. Our resource was completed actually in the summer of 2022, and that's when we came together in person. That was really meaningful for our team because all of the work happened virtually in the context of the pandemic. We came together on the CAMH campus and we had an opportunity to socialize, reflect on the process, and we actually reviewed the final content together as well. And then what you can see here is after the resource was completed in October, we had a soft launch, And then we did some accessibility work after that. And then we launched our event now. Sorry, there's an announcement in my background, and I'm going to pass it on. Slide, please.
Thanks, Stephanie. So as Alexa said, my role is as a family engagement and research coordinator at CAMH. And what I help to do is facilitate some of the engagement aspects of projects like these. So I came on board actually to help the caregiver smaller group co-create and co-design the caregiver aspects of the guide. But what I want to just briefly talk about is that we use various frameworks of engaging advisors on projects such as these. And this just illustrates a very simple framework of various levels of engagement. So what we know from the literature and what we know from engagement frameworks, you can have consultation advice from advisors, which is very minimal. It could be simple feedback. You can then a little bit more engagement is to involve advisors helping to make some decisions, and to moving towards collaboration where advisors are very involved in the formation and the decisions and working as partners in the project and on the most important aspects of the project. And finally, into the real co-design aspects of engagement really would mean that the projects are initiated by advisors and the project and is led by advisors, and the project team or folks at CAMH take a secondary role. And I would say for this project, we floated really from involved to collaborate to co-design, and at various aspects, advisors were leading, especially the youth team, and they'll describe it, were leading the co-design process. There were others where it fell back to the core team, as Stephanie talked about. So just keep in mind that when engagement happens, it really is a bit fluid, but really the purpose was to have our family and youth advisors really be involved in that co-design level. So next slide, please. So I'm going to hand it over to Shailene here, and to really focus on the reasons why caregivers wanted to step in. So go ahead, Shailene.
Thanks, Connie. So why caregivers really want to step in, for me, it's absolutely, this is work of the heart after navigating alongside our person who, it was a really, really difficult journey. So wanting to help others kind of maybe navigate their journey a little bit differently with some tips and ideas from other folks who have been there and been through it. So really, we don't want families to go through what we went through. As sometimes there are silos which create barriers to care. This can feel like a really, really lonely, hard journey sometimes. So having someone to walk alongside it with you, even in the format of these tip sheets, is helpful. It was also really hard for me to figure out, and for other caregivers to figure out, where do I fit as a parent and where do I fit as a caregiver? So hopefully these tip sheets will again provide some guidance with that. Collaborating with others on this project, we hope to provide ideas that are helpful. We wanted to create something that really is a connection. Caregivers and families absolutely belong and are a part of this process. And in the design of this guide, we're hoping to kind of bridge that gap between youth, clinicians, and those who love them by connecting caregivers with some information and ideas that they may not have seen or heard of previously. Another really, really super important heart work piece is letting other caregivers know that you're not alone. This can be a really emotional journey, and sometimes it can be somewhat isolating. So it's really important to emphasize the value of the caregiver perspective in addition to the voice of the youth, as caregivers matter and need support too. Hope. That was a word that I struggled with for a long time, but hope is a really important piece here. As advisors, we get the journey that we've been on, and it has been full of heartache at times. However, holding on to hope in those really challenging times matters probably the most. Finding a way to practice joy every day, and it is a practice, and hold on to hope that things can and do improve. As a caregiver advisor amongst the team, we were able to kind of bridge to the core team, providing multiple perspectives and viewpoints of what the day-to-day looks like and what works and what may not work effectively. Highlighting the importance of the youth voice, I think, is also something that caregivers do pretty well, as it's so necessary for all of us to be on the same team, honoring each other's voices and ideas. Connie, is there anything else you would like to add to that?
No, I think you got it right on, Shailene. That was
Thank,
great.
thanks, Connie. Next slide, please.
So yeah, let's talk about what the youth hope for this resource was. Well, we say in this community a lot, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. We are all very, very different. And originally on this project, I was the only autistic advisor on the guide as a part of the core group. But it was clear that a wider group of advisors were necessary to include multiple opinions and lived experience, so a full advisory group of autistic youth were added to the group. The way that in which autism and co-occurring conditions present can vary widely from person to person. This is why it was so important to have a diverse group of advisors with different lived experiences of autism and depression. I did not want to speak for all autistic people because I don't think that I have that ability. So in this guide, we take the time to lay out a number of different possible signs that could warn of depression in autistic individuals, but also recognize that no one single symptom or group of symptoms is necessarily an indicator. The main concern that we highlight in the guide is a change in behavior. The team discussed that many autistic experiences of depression are more in line with dysthymia or a persistent low-grade depression rather than major depressive disorder. So it was extraordinarily important to highlight that change in behavior rather than simply the presence of some symptoms as a major part of depression in our community. We wanted to create a guide that truly included the way that autistic youth think and organize information, both internally and externally. The tips were developed by the Youth Advisory Group based on what we wish we had known when getting treatment for depression, and based on what had worked for them. Getting support for any sort of health issue, physical or mental, can be extremely overwhelming for many people, whether they're autistic or not. And for autistic people, however, this feeling of overwhelm can make the healthcare system particularly difficult to navigate. We included suggestions on how to make this process easier with various tools and tips to help make communication and information retention less challenging. And we'll go over those more specifically in a few slides. Next slide, please.
So I want to pick up where Riley was talking about and just give you a bit of context in terms of the caregiver group. And there were 3 caregivers on the group, myself, and then somebody from the core team, as Stephanie mentioned. But in creating this slide for you folks today, we all got together as that small caregiver team and came up with these bullet points. And I think most specifically, everybody was in unison of our group that we wanted a resource that was really specific for caregivers, and one that could be shared maybe with and between others, and maybe with their loved ones, and then could review some of those things. So maybe as a jumping off point or a talking point to help caregivers perhaps review these things with their loved ones. And we also, as a group, really wanted this tip sheet to have tips, which it does, to have resources for caregivers specifically, which is often lots of gaps in resources for caregivers, and also to contain some reflections, which we also as a group felt that those supportive messages could be inspirational, or like Shailene said earlier, really offer hope and to know that you're not alone. So I think that was the focus of the design, was to make sure that we wanted to include all those things. And I think overall that the idea is to really, that the tip sheet for caregivers was to really bring this awareness and understanding of the co-occurring conditions of autism and mental health. And as we all know and have experienced, there's so many gaps in this information, and what Stephanie said earlier about it. And we really wanted to focus on um, a, a tip sheet that could bring that awareness and understanding. And I'm going to turn it over to Shailene to talk a little bit more about that and the other couple of things we came up with.
Thanks, Connie. So one of the last couple of things that we talked about, and one of the things is behavior. And I know Riley just talked about that, so I find it really interesting. I found it really confusing as a caregiver to hear the talk about behavior a lot, without kind of also figuring out that it was kind of an expression of an unmet need and needing to dig a little deeper in there. So focusing on learning new skills, developing a better understanding of emotions, and being genuinely curious were really super important on the journey to not simply see the behavior in and of itself, but to figure out, what is this saying? The other thing too about really feeling empowered by having an open dialogue, as it's so valuable to have a great relationship with the person who is suffering, and also to advocate alongside them with clinicians and service providers in a way that makes sense for that person. So, kind of trying to build bridges and teams focusing on the needs of the youth is super empowering. So, the voice of the caregiver in this is really an important reflection. And we also need to make sure that the support is respectful to both the youth and the caregiver. Next slide, please.
So our co-development process was long and complicated, but the specific important parts we wanted to bring up because we thought that it would be important to share. To begin with, we'll start at the beginning, I suppose. And the important piece that we wanted to talk about here was that where we started wasn't actually where we ended up. So a lot of the times, especially in research and, project creation, you have an idea of what you're going to do going in, and very often it doesn't end there. Sometimes it ends better. I certainly think that we have created something more impressive than what we had started with, but we didn't know quite what we were doing at the beginning. It has changed a lot over time. As Stephanie said with our timeline earlier, we started in one place to figure out what was feasible, and that shaped the process for the rest of the project. And as Stephanie said earlier, it took about a year to figure out the goals and the specifics of the project that we were creating. And in that process, the group coalesced and developed comfort and trust among members to be able to share and contribute amongst us and create a project from an idea to something that can actually help others. I'll pass that off for the next.
Thank you, Riley. I mean, I'll just pick up on some of the really great points that you made, that, in this organic process, the governance structure was it kind of formed over time. So we didn't realize at the beginning that we would have this core group, and then we would have two spin-off groups that would be content development focused. And so because of the organic process, and also because of the nature of sort of virtual connections, and the nature of the time during the pandemic, there were a few things that were kind of um, very dynamic. And as part of that, I think we um, started to figure out that we needed these kind of two spin-off groups as we went, but we didn't necessarily take the time to really think with the group, okay, what's the next phase going to look like? What should the governance process be? And who wants to do what? It sort of continued to happen organically. And in hindsight, it would be nice to really think, to go through content. We had a lot of working meetings, but also think a lot about process, and when there are inflection points in the co-development process, to come together as a team and think about, okay, what's the next phase really going to look like, and map that out. We also realized as we went on that it's really important to have multiple voices represented, so that one self-advocate or one caregiver advocate doesn't feel like they have to represent everyone, and that they have someone else to kind of buddy up with them at each meeting, so that they could sort of share that load to some extent. Shailene, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I would just reiterate that it feels like a pretty daunting task to represent a group of people when, as Riley said it at the beginning, one person, one person. Because I feel like so many voices can add value to the whole process. And the next is creating safer spaces. Connie, did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I wanted to actually just emphasize that in a co-development process, it's actually really, as Stephanie said, like a lot happens organically, but there's a lot of deliberate things you can do to ensure that safe spaces are created. And I think it's some of the lessons learned for sure, but I think that deliberately allowing time to build the relationships. And I know that in our little caregiver offshoot group, we really did that. I mean, we had maybe a year, Shailene, if I recall. Like it was, and we met maybe monthly or every 6 weeks, and we had Ami from the core team with us too. But we really allowed time to get to know each other, and it really helped us um, to 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 do the work that we were tasked to do. And I think it was really important for making everybody in that space feel really good about their contributions and open about it, because it was a safe space. So that's a really important aspect when in co-development of stuff like this, that it really does need some of that thinking and planning on how to be deliberate about it. And we just took the time in our group, for instance, to get to continue to get to know each other, and that really allowed it to then organically develop. So that's all I really want to say about that, but it's really important in this kind of process. I don't know, Riley, were you going to talk about the wording, or was that Alex that was going to go for that?
That's me. So kind of going back to the point about, representation and, not one person having to or being able to represent everyone. There were a lot of different problems we had to address with terminology. Uh, we all had different perspectives that made it kind of tricky to figure out what wording to use. People get very nervous about it, often get stuck on wording. Um, we have to be, transparent about the choices we made. We have to find, where are the places where we can find agreement? Where do we, reminding ourselves that we have a common goal? How can we come together? And that whole process, I think, really kind of came all together at the very end, when we sat together in person for the first time and had an opportunity to sit down and go through the whole guide together and wordsmith a bit. And I'll pass it off to Riley to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, so as Alex said, we came together at the end of the creation of this project to celebrate in person, which was very exciting and very difficult to do since we were still very deep in the pandemic. But it was worthwhile. It was a socially distanced celebration in one of CAMH's outdoor spaces during the summer. Thank goodness the weather was nice because we got to sit outside. And I got to meet my fellow youth advisor, Alex, for the first time. And actually, since then, we've developed both a friendship and a working relationship that I'm extraordinarily grateful for. On both a personal level and from a professional perspective, so many autistic people doing work like this aren't creating relationships with other autistic people, which is something that I think so many of us want. So it felt like an internal advertisement of this guide that we've already created some autistic relationships and hope that other people are going to be able to use those same social attributes for themselves. And then we were finally able to see the fruits of our labor on this project, and now you get to see it too in a couple of slides. So let's move on.
So I'll just speak a little bit to the lessons that we learned. I think we've talked a lot about that already, but one of the lessons is that the mix matters. It's important to have a diversity of our opinions and perspectives and backgrounds. And it's also really important to find a fit. Even though you might be thinking about the fit in terms of the folks that come together to begin with, that fit really kind of develops and coalesces, as we said, over time. And it's really nice that we had the time to build those relationships, and really we took the time. There were some of our meetings that were completely dedicated to sort of communication and making sure that folks felt heard and felt that their perspectives were understood. Um, the next point is bringing caregivers, youth, and clinicians together early in the project. So we were really fortunate to be able to mix all of these different perspectives. And there's a question from the chat that maybe we'll talk about during the Q&A about bringing those different perspectives together. But the fact that we were able to come together early and figure out what the project focus would be together, I think really made folks feel engaged, and that their values and their perspectives were baked into this process right from the beginning. It wasn't the total beginning; it was the almost beginning, and I want to just acknowledge that. And part of the challenges with the co-development process is their funding needs to be available in order to compensate those individuals who get engaged, who don't have another mode of compensation. And so it's hard to start right at the beginning if those funding resources are not available to be tapped into right away. And as I mentioned before, it's good to recognize those inflection points when those organic changes are happening, and to kind of reflect on that and think about it as a group, and think about the different pathways that may offshoot, and that everybody's kind of aware of them and thinking about those different decision points, and different perspectives are being brought to the group at those times. Connie, pass it to
Yeah,
you.
yeah, and I just wanted to make a couple of comments about the importance of communication, as Stephanie said. I think that, for instance, we as that offshoot caregiver group, I think in the early phases of it, we were feeling like we were working in a bit of a silo, and we didn't always have the insights of what the core team was doing. And what did occur over time is that we had one of the caregivers who was on the core team join our separate team, and it really helped to foster the communication between the core team and our caregiver advisory team. So I think it's really important that advisors to a project like this be kept abreast of of the expectations of what they're expected to do. It wasn't always clear. I think that, we worked it out, but it wasn't always clear what the expectations were, who was to do them. Again, these are all projects that need management, that have sometimes not so big budgets, and you're kind of operating on and all of our advisors get compensated for their time at CAMH on an hourly basis. So it was keeping track of that. Even though they're volunteers, they're being compensated by the hour. So it's how do you manage all of that and manage the communication flow and make sure everybody knows who's doing what when. So that some of those things broke down a little bit, but we regained and built them back up through a little bit of shifting of expectations and getting a clear understanding. And I think that that's what happened, and we were able to really come out with a guide that we're really proud of. So yeah, sometimes it doesn't always go as straightforward as you expect. So that's a lesson learned too, that you could also, in doing a project like this in the future, plan out some of that communication. How's that going to happen? How are we going to be the most efficient at it? It's not always obvious, it isn't, and things are always moving. So I just wanted to add that we learned that lesson in this kind of project. So I think we should move on to I think the next slide dives a little bit, into Riley and Alex's specific.
Yeah, we're going to take some time to, we're basically transitioning to look a bit closer at the package. We're going to look at specifically the youth-specific tip sheets. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. So first of all, what might depression look like in autistic people? As previously mentioned, many signs of depression in autistic people may present as behavioral changes that could differ from presentation in an allistic or non-autistic population. In the guide, we gave examples of signs and symptoms, as well as what that might look like. So some examples that may be apparent included little interest or pleasure in activities, difficulty sleeping. That could look like more or less sleep than usual, changes in energy level, feeling tired or restless. Really, it's a focus on change. The change itself can often be an indicator. Some less frequent examples might be changes in thinking or processing speed, like brain fog, differences in physical pain threshold could be higher or lower than usual. Sensory overload and an increase in meltdowns and shutdowns. Next slide, please.
So one other thing that we have in our tool is getting help and tips for diagnostic processes, both for, depression and just general tools. So some of the tips that we have include letting you know about preparation pre-appointments. So bringing written notes, or a caregiver, a friend, somebody that can help to translate for your practitioner. You can also develop schemas before your appointments, such as who will be at them, what will happen, planning those things out in advance to reduce some of the anxiety that autistic people often have when in the presence of practitioners. We also have some tips, again, from youth for during appointments, such as some questions that you should ask practitioners, how to fill out questionnaires, understanding some of the questions and talk that often happens that is often difficult for autistic folks. In addition to that, there's communication, individual to professional, and how to access assistive technology or AAC, and not always knowing the answers to questions. We also have the clarity of information, explanations of why some questions are asked, what those mean, so that the understanding from an autistic perspective makes more sense to them, and a lot of choices and alternate options to assist youth. Basically, getting help is very important, and that was a real priority in the creation of it, because it's not just looking out for what might become a diagnosis of depression, but also how do you access the institutions that we have to go through. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Riley. So next we look at coping strategies. The youth advisors, we shared various coping skills that we ourselves had either used or seen being used by other community members to improve mental health in an autistic affirming way. So some examples included keeping yourself fed, having safe foods nearby, stuff that's that you know you're able to eat at any given time and are easy to make, resting and recharging, having a safe and comfortable environment, which, you know, we also recognized is not always possible. Creative outlets and hobbies, having you know, easy access to our various special interests and being able to continually engage in them, setting simple, easy to achieve goals. Oftentimes when an autistic person is in the middle of you know, a depressive episode, it can be really easy to feel like you're just not able to do anything. So setting those small little things and being able to see, oh, I am actually able to accomplish this, and this can be really, really helpful. And having a safe person who can support you through all of this. Again, you know, not always possible, but to the best of your ability, if you're able to have someone like that, it really makes a huge difference. And with that, I'll pass it off to Shailene to introduce the next section.
Thank you. So the next section is similar to what Alex just did in terms of the caregiver specific tip sheet and a note to caregivers. When we worked together on this, and there was a lot of work to condense our many ideas in a way that we felt represented well the ideas of all of the caregivers involved in this. First of all, I'd like to say that coping with depression is really hard for youth and also for those who are involved in their lives, so that we hope the ideas that we've put together here are both helpful and validating in your own journey. So the first one, education is super important. Try to get the facts and all of the facts that you can. Remembering, of course, that autism and depression may uniquely represent each other. So ask your youth, ask the person in your life. Not only reach out for the formal education channels, but also ask, how can I help? So hopefully the resources in here may be helpful in providing some direction as to where to connect to that information. You know your person really well. If you're concerned, be open, share your observations, and ask for their feedback. That is a really important link. Really value that relationship with your person so that they feel open and able to come to you when there may be concerns. Focusing on that relationship builds trust and it helps you feel comfortable in sharing. It's also important that we're sharing what our youth is okay with us sharing, and also to note that if safety is a concern, it may be necessary to share private information. No one is to blame here. Depression may be at times expressed harshly, so there might be some words that kind of hurt. Remember, though, this is not personal. Depression impacts how a person feels, thinks, and acts. Walk alongside each other, recognizing that pivoting is going to be a natural and necessary part of this process as we learn new things, even the coping skills that were just referenced that apply equally, I think, to caregivers too. We all need to make sure that we're employing some coping mechanisms here. But as we learn these skills, make sure we're walking side by side, step by step. Self-care. I don't think I can reiterate enough how important self-care is. We can't pour from an empty cup. Try to hold yourself as though you were your own best friend with compassion, as we're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. Mistakes create an opportunity to learn and to do something differently. Make sure you're finding time for joy, even in these really challenging times, as caregivers need and deserve breaks too. And again, as we referenced at the beginning, you're not alone. We're here as proof that there are other people along this same road. And it's really important to connect to those people so that you can feel understood, as we're super strong as a team, and asking for help from others is a strength. Next slide, Stephanie will take us through the clinician-specific checklist.
Thanks, Shailene. So as you can see from all of the different tip sheet packages, so we have these kind of separate tip sheet packages to support different parts of the process in coping and getting help. And what we envision for the note to mental health professionals is that, you know, if a caregiver or a youth is has maybe been diagnosed with autism and depression, or they are thinking that this diagnosis might fit for them, and they're hoping to get that to resonate with their clinician, this tip sheet can actually be sort of handed to the clinician to give them a little bit more background knowledge, being aware that, you know, many clinicians don't have lots of experience in either identifying co-occurring mental health conditions in autistic youth, or providing care. And so this tip sheet really provides some background, what the prevalence is of various co-occurring mental health conditions in autistic individuals, and considerations related to depression. So depression is at least twice as common in autistic youth as in the general population. But if you look across the literature, different studies suggest different prevalence rates, and it's probably more common than just double. And there are these barriers to accessing care. So experience among clinicians is one of them. Sometimes, you know, agencies and clinics have particular inclusion criteria, and sometimes having autism is an exclusion for receiving care. And also just our system is so fragmented, it's hard to know what door to knock on. And so part of this guide is trying to help people with that process and just navigating all of that difficulty. There's some tips in this guide on improving assessment and recognizing depression in autistic youth. Like Alex mentioned before, it's a lot focused on change in presentation, kind of thinking about what's always been there and what's been a change in routines and behaviors and sleep, etc., that might represent a co-occurring mental health condition, whether it be depression or another co-occurring condition, and what to look out for there. There's tips on setting up the assessment. So really trying to be flexible to help with engagement. You know, phone appointments, virtual appointments, using chat, using questionnaires to help folks feel more comfortable engaging and help them to relate their perspective. There's some tips on how to modify the approach to care. There's not that much evidence-based research out there to guide what should be different and specific to depression care in autism. So it's kind of interpreting what's out there, and there are some tips on that, and then there are some resources. And with that, I think we're finished with taking you all through the process and the various tip packages. And I just want to reiterate that what Shailene said, that this is really heart work, that this has been work that has been important to each of us for different reasons, and we really hope that it gets used and that it's useful to all of you and to others out there.